Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm pleased to be here today and to talk to you a little bit about Hidden Figures, the movie, the book, and a little about my career. And so I got a great introduction, and I thank Becky for that introduction. Let's see, where do I start? For the last year and a half, or almost 2 years now, I've spent a lot of my time going around speaking to students and at all levels. In fact, I spoke to the University of Texas engineering students in Dallas a couple of nights ago. And so I have really enjoyed that. I've enjoyed meeting the students. I have certainly enjoyed a lot of middle school and high school students speak about how inspired they are about the stories of the ladies in the book. And I think that's a gratifying feeling. When I retired from NASA in 2007, there were two young ladies at my retirement party who spoke. One was a math major, and she wanted to switch to systems engineering, and she said everybody was telling her she couldn't do it. And she said, and she saw an Ebony magazine that had a short write-up of me in there talking about how I had switched from mathematics over to engineering. And she said, I said, if she can do it, I can do it. And so she is now working as a systems engineer at NASA Langley. And the second one was in high school when I used to speak at a lot of high schools. And she heard me when she was still in high school. And she spoke saying that she decided to become an engineer because she heard me in high school. So those two testimonies from those young ladies really made me feel good. When if you know that when you're talking or somebody has written something about you, that it does inspire the next generation. And from all indications, Margot's book and the movie and everything have really inspired a lot of young people around the country. And my prayer is that they stay inspired and that they move on. Because I will tell you, I came through the Sputnik inspiration. When Sputnik went up and this school system in this country were kind of shaken and everything, because I hid under my desk in school and everything else because we were afraid of bombs being dropped on us. And so if the young people are being inspired, then it's worth going around trying to speak to them and have them take the right courses. I've even talked to some of them and said, you know, the people in the Silicon Valley tell us that they cannot find enough young people in this country who can do the jobs at Apple and at several of the other technical companies that are out in the Silicon Valley. And I said, are you telling me that the young people that they're bringing in from China and India are smarter than you are? I said, I don't believe it. If you take the right courses and you study your work, you can be ready for those jobs out there. And they left me saying they knew that and they were going to do it. So, I mean, and that's what we hope that we can get the young people to do, to take those courses and to know they might have to work hard, but working hard is part of it. So anyway, we have been talking, a lot of schools have bused school children into areas and shown them the movie when the movie came out. And we have talked to them about some of the lessons in the movie. And you all are all in the group that studied the book and everything. So you all are going to tell me I said something wrong about that book. But one of the things we talk about is the fact that all three of the ladies in the movie spoke up for what they wanted to do. They didn't just sit there and be quiet. They said, I want to be a supervisor, I want to be an engineer, and so forth and so on. And that's pretty important to do. And I had the occasion in my life that I needed to speak up and say some things, and I did. So that was certainly a lesson that they spoke up for what they wanted. Another one, I thought, a couple of things about Dorothy Vaughan. She when she walked through the she was going to her supervisor's desk, and she walked and saw the big empty room, and she said, what's going in that big room out there that I walked by? And her supervisor says, oh, that's going to be an IBM. Yeah, that's a computer, you know, that's going to calculate a lot faster than you ladies do. And well, they will just do it faster. And Dorothy said, well, that's good for NASA. But she was also thinking, but that's not so good for us, because that means our jobs are going to go away. And of course, the next scene in the movie is Dorothy has gone to the bookstore and she has found a book on Fortran programming, and she is slipping into the computer center there where he's trying to get the computer to run, where the IBM man is trying to get it to run. She went in, she actually got it to run herself in the movie, and but she learned to program. She taught herself how to program out of that book. And not only did she teach herself to program, she taught all the ladies who worked under her to program, such that if you saw the movie, you noticed that at the end of the movie, because Dorothy was working with the West Computers, the all-black group. At the end of the movie, the other computers were asking her to teach them how to program, and you saw them walking in there with the computer so they too could learn how to program that IBM computer. And so the lesson there is know what's going on around you. And I tell the young students, well, you know, don't plan to go to college and study for 4 years for a job that is going away. You know, we're reading all these articles about the artificial intelligence in automobiles and trucks now, and that how many thousands of driving jobs are going to go away. So a student choosing their career need to know that. They at least need to be aware of it. There are lots of articles you read about students going to college for 4 years and they come out and they can't get a job. And that depends on what they have majored in and everything. So when they are deciding what they like, what jobs are growing, what jobs pay, and all of those kinds of things that they really ought to look at when they're choosing their careers, they need to be aware that some things do go away. And I keep preaching that kind of stuff to my grandson, but he doesn't want to listen too well. But so know what's going on around you. Even in the workplace, you kind of need to understand what's happening and be aware of that. Let's say, and of course, saying what you want. Mary Jackson kept saying that she wanted to be an engineer and she wanted to work in the wind tunnel. When she had to go through the court system to go before the judge to get permission to go to the White Hampton High School, she did her homework. She was able to get that judge to rule for her, because she says, I know you were the first in your family to go to college. I know you were the first in your family named a judge. I'd like to be the first black female at NASA Langley to work as an engineer. So you know what it means to be first. What do you think people are going to remember you longest for turning down that young black lady who asked to be given permission to go to Hampton High School? Or you were indeed the one who chose the young lady who became the first black engineer at Hampton High School. And that kind of touched his heart, and he ruled in her favor. And so do your homework. And I do know that lots of times when you have to interview for a job or interview for a promotion or things like that, the folks, they feel very good when you have studied the company that you're trying to get a job at, or a position you're trying, when you have thought about that position and maybe some ideas you have about that position. That works for you. So prepare. Do your homework and prepare anytime you've got to go before somebody and kind of speak like that. And so those are some of the lessons that we talk about with the students when we talk about that movie. And despite the fact that they all suffered discrimination, they did their jobs well. So even though Catherine got dirty looks and everything else. She did her job well, and she worked really hard. There were a lot of liberties taken in the movie. I said, Catherine, did you ever run through the rain to go to the bathroom? And she said, no. So there was when Margot wrote the book, and the script writer wrote the script at the same time, because Margot had sent out all of her proposals to about 16 publishers. She had gotten 14 rejections. And I think, well, yeah, a lot of people would have quit then. That's why we use the word persistence all the time. She actually applied to go to writing school. And I'm assuming that that is about when it happened, because she asked me to write some letters of recommendation for her. And I did, and she was accepted, but I didn't know about the history of how many proposals, how many rejections, until an article came out in the newspaper later. So, but she got the 14, but number 15 was the jackpot. She got the contract on the book. Hollywood called in a matter of weeks that says, this has got to be a movie. I mean, it doesn't normally happen like that. And so the lady who called had a lot of Hollywood connections. I think she knew a director interested. Pharrell Williams was interested and willing to give money to help put that movie on. And so things really took off. But so now Margot has to write the book, because she hasn't written the book yet. She wrote the proposal. She's got to write the book at the same time as the script writer is writing the script for the movie. And she says that the script writer used to send a sample, and she would say, well, no, it didn't happen like that. It didn't happen like that. The script writer says, wait a minute. I'm going to have to teach you how you have to write scripts. You don't write scripts like you write books. And, you want people to sit there for a couple of hours and really enjoy and be able to follow that movie and come back and see it again and things like that. And so that's kind of the way it worked. She had all of the basic facts of the story in the proposal, and she kind of added things in there. So Mary Jackson in the book had been assigned to a building where Wind Tunnel was, where there was not a bathroom for African-American female. And so the script writers transferred that knowledge over to Katherine Johnson and made it a fairly substantial part of the story. Mm-hmm. And the other thing was in 1961, when that story was made, the West computers didn't exist, because the West computers were the all-black group of computers. That's the way they started out in 1943, when they first hired black computers at Langley. And but when Sputnik went up in 1957, October of 1957, they started looking for how they were going to make a space agency in this country, because Langley was NACA at the time. It was the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics. That had been formed in 1917 because though we invented the airplane in this country, the Germans and the French outdid America in developing the airplane, because they wanted to use them in the war, in World War I. So after World War I, somebody went to put President Woodrow Wilson and said, hey, we got to do something about coordinating the research on airplanes in the United States. And that's when he created NACA. So in 1957, I think, the military probably wanted to take the space agency. There was, I guess, debate over who was going to take it. But ultimately, Eisenhower took the NACA centers, of which Langley and Hampton was the first, but there were also 2 or 3 others by that time. And he made them the beginnings of NASA, which was formed in 1958. And so once it became NASA, there was no West computers. They did not have the segregation there, and so that was kind of something to make the movie better, and understand. And the The three ladies that, of course, were in the movie were in the West Computers. I was not in the West Computers. In 1961, when the movie was set, I was also still in college. I remember John Glenn's parade. All of the ladies had a daughter that was in my, or a daughter or a child in my class. And so we were kind of the next generation. Catherine's daughter was my classmate. Dorothy Vaughn's son was my classmate, and Mary Jackson's niece was my classmate. So we were all seniors that year in February 1962, when John Glenn flew. And so in the book, Margot kind of cast me as on their shoulders. And that's why I've used this title. They were, I was hired 25 years after Dorothy Vaughan, and 15 years after Mary Jackson and Katherine Johnson. And though I never worked with them at NASA Langley, they were all still there when I went there. And they all, I worked with Katherine and Mary in a technical organization. There was a technical organization that had been formed at Hampton University called the National Technical Association. I think it was the first African-American technical association in the country, and it was started by the architects at Hampton University. And so that charter existed, and so while we were at Langley, we sort of just reinvigorated that charter, and the engineers used that and used that to work with students. And so we, as a group, mostly at Langley, there were maybe a couple of people from the shipyard and things that we have there. But we would give math contests to middle school students so that they would get some ease in working with mathematics and feel more comfortable that they knew and understood the mathematics. We would do SAT tutorials for high school students. And for college students, we would invite students from North Carolina, and I think some as far as Tennessee, Virginia, Washington, Maryland, to actually submit an application to present a paper on an internship that they had had, what the research was that they did and the value of that research, but to get experience in giving a technical paper before an audience. And so they were selected. They would send in their applications. Several were selected, and they would come and they would give the presentation, and there would be judges in the audience, and they would actually win cash prizes for the best presentation for what they had done. But that's a very, very important skill that anybody, I think, in many businesses have, and that is to be able to get up and give a presentation. I think I had never given a technical, maybe I had never given any talk until I was in graduate school, in which I gave a brief talk about one of the topics I worked on there. But once I started giving more and more talks at Langley, I joined Toastmasters to get a better feeling for talking before a group, for answering a question on my feet, because you get practice in that too. And I don't know that I learned to do like a lot of politicians where they kind of step a little bit to the side and answer that question instead of the main question. But it's an extremely important skill, and if you can take that technical subject and make the audience understand it, it's even better. I was in a presentation at work one day when a senator was there, and a young man was talking about the difference in one of the wind tunnels we had, talking about the Reynolds number. And about 5 or 10 minutes into the presentation, the senator stood up and he says, "You know, I don't know a word you're talking about. I don't understand a thing about it. And if you are not able to explain it to me, I'm going to probably get up and leave." And so he sat down, and that was a really tough spot for that speaker that day. But he couldn't do it. He had his charts and everything there, and he couldn't convert it. So about 10 minutes later, so the senator did get up and walk out. But his staff did stay there, and I'm sure they would have explained it to them when they got back to their office and everything. But, in fact, you find out that it's almost a gift to be able to do that. And some people can do it very well and some people can't. And so anyway, that's kind of how I worked with the ladies there. And Margot's father worked with me, and I remember her as a child, and we sort of talked about some books. She was living in Mexico when she was starting writing this book, and so when she would come back to Hampton, we would have lunch, and we talked about a book that we both liked that had a lot of history in it. And Margot did a lot of research and actually put a lot of history into Hidden Figures. And so she did a lot of research looking up everything, and she did a great job on that. So let me talk a little bit about myself now, and then maybe you all can ask some questions if you want to. So I'm from Monroe. I was born there. My parents and all my sisters and brothers came from Georgia, Alabama. Had a brother born in Florida also. But so I grew up in Monroe. I was sort of a tomboy. I could beat all the boys in the neighborhood on the bicycle and on the skates and and all those things. But and I liked to help my dad change the tires on the car. I think at one point when the car was having trouble starting, I learned how to prime the carburetor to start the car. And Mother said she gave me a doll when I was 5 years old, and instead of playing with the doll very much, I cut her open to see why she could talk. So I think that might have been a little indication of maybe some of the work that I would have liked in the future. Let me see, Mother taught school. She taught in Union County right outside Charlotte. And when I was 3 years old, going on 4, she had a babysitter keeping me, but she took me from the babysitter and she took me to school with her. And she taught 1st through 4th grade in one room, and 5th through 7th was in the other room there. And I admire the teachers who can do that. But they could do it. And so she told me, she wasn't putting me in school. She told me I could go outside and play. But the school was in the middle of the country, and there was nobody else outside. So I said, well, there's nobody out there to play with. So I stayed in the classroom, and I apparently did the work and passed the 1st grade because she promoted me to the 2nd grade. And I went the 2nd year to the Monroe school in the 2nd grade. And so I went to that school through 10th grade, and I was always about 2 years younger than most of the people in my class. So by the time I got to be 13, we were having a little difficulties about me wanting to do everything that the 15-year-olds would do, and because I wasn't quite as old. But and then the school was right across the street from my house in Monroe, whereas Mother was way out in the county, so I would get home before she'd get home, and very often my dad wasn't there. She didn't like that too much either. So in the 11th grade, she sent me to a boarding school in Asheville, North Carolina. It was a Methodist boarding school there. And so I did okay with my schooling in Monroe and everything. And when she sent me to Allen, I was very apprehensive about that. I cried every day for a semester. And she told me later that she had decided she was going to let me come home, because I cried because the fair was at the end of September and I was going to miss the fair. and things like that. And she, so anyway, she's at the end of the 1st semester, I went home. It was after Christmas. And I went home for Christmas, and I called her at the end of the 1st semester. And she said, I did not mention home at all. I said, we're having a dance Saturday night, and I want some money to buy a dress. And that was all. She sent me the money for the dress, I guess, and she said she never heard another word about home. And so I got over my homesickness, and I was never homesick in college or anything like that. I learned to kind of be independent. And but I took plane geometry at Allen, and I just absolutely fell in love with it. I had algebra while I was in Monroe, and when I fell in love with the plane geometry, and I think maybe there was something in that class that more related the mathematics to the physical world than I had experienced in some things, and I think that's where my heart was. That you could describe a physical situation with a mathematical problem and solve that, and then you've got the answer to a physical real world problem. And every time I have talked to students, helping them with math, I talked to a lot of college students. Why do I have to know how to do such and such and such a thing? You know, when am I going to ever use this? And I think it is actually very, very important for them to know what it's used for, because I think it actually motivates them a little bit more to understand it. My granddaughter called me one day. She says, "Grandma, I got a recipe for 5 people, and I've got to figure out what it has to be for 17 people." I said, "That's why you need to know fractions." Yeah, because that's what you got to use to do that and everything. So I think it's important. It was important for me, I think, to understand how the different mathematics was used in the real world. So, but I fell in love with that, and I decided I wanted to be a mathematician. I had actually thought of biological sciences before, but I think taking that class and taking physical science and everything, I realized that my heart really lay more with the mathematics and the physical science. And so I went to Hampton to school, and the reason I went to Hampton to school was I had gone through the school in Monroe behind my sisters and brothers and always being compared with my sisters and brothers. And so they went to Charlotte and Knoxville and Nashville. So I had a friend who had a sister who came to Virginia. So I came to Virginia and came to Hampton University. And when I got there, all of the people who said that they were going to kind of major in math, they had calculus and trigonometry and analytical geometry, and I had plane geometry. That was my highest class, because neither Allen High School in Asheville nor the school in Monroe taught anything higher than the plane geometry. And so my attitude was, well, you know what? I will start where I am, and I will learn it and move forward. Then my dad called me, and he said, "Christine, this is 1958, and I don't think that there are a lot of jobs in this country for an African-American female who's a mathematician. And I think you should get a teacher certificate so you can get a job when you get out of school." And at some point during that time, I had begun to kind of think of this formula, which I think has played a pretty big part in my life. P to the 4th power. P times P times P times P. The first thing was, if you really think you know where your passion is and what your job, what you would really like to work at, perceive of yourself in that job, see yourself doing that job. And so I had perceived of myself as a mathematician. And then the second P that went with that was plan. What do you have to do if you want to be a mathematician? Well, in my case, the easiest statement would be I had to learn a whole lot of mathematics, because I didn't have a very strong math background. And so that was the second P. The third P was prepare. So if you've got your plan, then you work your plan, you do it. And then the fourth P is persist. You will run into roadblocks, you will run into detours and everything. So you don't quit when you do that. You figure a way around it, or you solve that problem somehow and you keep going. And so I had been thinking about that and knew that I needed a lot of math. So, but I says, you know, my dad's really trying to look out for me. He's saying, I want you to be able to get a job when you get out of school. And so I said, okay, I'm going to go that direction, but I'm going to take every elective that I have while I'm in college. I am going to take a higher math class that was not required for me to be a high school mathematics teacher. And so that's what I did. And my senior year, I it looked like this. I think I had actually gotten all my requirements done except student teaching. And so I did my student teaching in solid geometry, and I took 4 math classes. Second semester, I did my student teaching in physics, and I took 4 math classes. So I graduated with my teacher certificate, and I had 24 hours of higher math classes that I didn't have to take for my teacher education degree, but certainly was what I wanted to take. And I came to Brunswick County in Virginia to teach my first year. And as soon as I got there, some of the teachers came up and said, hey, we drive up to Virginia State University on Saturdays to take in-service classes. Would you like to join us? And I said, sure, I'd be glad to. And so we went up to Virginia State, which was about 60 miles, and these classes were Saturday morning. And I signed up for a higher math class, and the head of the math department was my instructor for that class, which was good. And we did it that year, and then about 3 or 4 years later, I was teaching in Portsmouth. I had gotten married, and when I went to the classroom in Portsmouth, I asked the teachers, hey, would you all like to ride to Virginia State for some of the in-service classes up there? And I managed to get a carload of teachers to ride up to Virginia State. It was going to be Friday night that year, and it was 80 miles instead of 60 miles. So we did. We all went up to Petersburg on Friday evenings and took our classes and everything. And the first semester worked well. But you know what happened the second semester? They all quit, but me. So now I said, oh my gosh, you know, I cannot quit. I really want to finish what I'm doing. I will not quit. So I decided I was going to do it by myself. So after work on Fridays, I would drive to Petersburg, sit in the class for 2 or 3 hours, and then about 10 or so start home at night with my head hanging out the window, or chewing gum, or slapping my face, or doing whatever I had to do to try to stay awake getting home. But I was glad I did that. My husband had graduated from Virginia State, and he was awarded within that month or so a fellowship to get a master's degree in biology at Virginia State. So I says, well, that means we're going to probably be moving up there, and I'll need to get a job up there. So I wrote to all of the school systems around Petersburg, applying for a job, and I got one response back from Chesterfield County asking for a letter of recommendation. So I went to my principal and asked for a letter of recommendation, and he says, sure, I'd be glad to give you a letter of recommendation, but you give me your contract back. I don't want to be looking for a good math teacher in August. Oh my. So I says, well, I'm going to get that job. I'm going to get that job. Okay, so I turned in my contract, and he gave me the letter, and it was sent in and everything. And I never heard another word from Chesterfield County. So now I have nothing. So then the next Friday night or so, when I go back to the class up there, I went up to the teacher, head of the math department. Said, well, looks like we're going to be moving to Petersburg next year, and I was just wondering if you had any idea or any knowledge of a job that I might look into around here. He says, you're looking for a job? I said, yes. He says, well, let's go across the hall and talk to Dr. Hodkinson, who's head of the physics department, and he's looking for a research assistant in aerosol physics. So we went across the hall, and we talked to Dr. Hodkinson, and when I went home that night, I had that research fellowship to help him do calculations of light scattering of non-spherical particles, but it would also pay for me to get a master's degree, which I was able to do in applied mathematics, because I didn't really have the money to pay to go to school. And so it just worked out. 2 years later, when I was about to graduate, I said, let me go by the placement office. I had applied for a couple of teaching jobs at colleges. So I said, well, let me go by the placement office, and I went in, and the young lady said, well, where in the world have you been? Did you know NASA was here recruiting yesterday? I said, no, I didn't know a word about it. She says, well, you take this application and you fill it out and you get it right back to me. I'm going to mail it in. So I filled it out and gave it back to her, and she mailed it in, and within 3 weeks I had an offer from NASA. Wow. So it just, when I look back on that, several things in my life looks like they just fell into place. But I do know that if I had not done all that math in college, the extra ones that I think P to the fourth power kind of made me take, I would not have gotten that fellowship. I probably wouldn't have gotten in, I wouldn't have gotten in school. And and so that, just doing it several years earlier actually probably allowed me to do that. Taking those classes from that math professor, he recommended me for that position. So, that's what you call being ready when the opportunity shows up. So sometimes you have to do things ahead of time, and when that opportunity does come, you're ready for it. And so I think that's what happened in my life. And so I was hired by NASA. That was in 1967, and I went into, they had no segregated computer pools there. I was hired as a computer, and on their shoulders, I think because they were doing good work. I was in the reentry physics branch where before I got there, were the group that calculated the angle, the attitude at which a spaceship would have to come back into the atmosphere. Because if it comes in at the wrong angle, it could bounce back out and just keep going out in space. The other thing you need to know is how hot that vehicle will get. What is the speed at which it's coming into the atmosphere? And how hot is that vehicle going to get? Will the skin of that vehicle withstand the temperatures that it will actually have, or will it burn up? And so those are the kinds of things that the engineers in the reentry physics branch worked on. There were lots of wind tunnels around the facility that we also worked on and everything. So I didn't actually get to do any of those calculations because I went there months after Apollo 1 burned up, and they didn't do any flying of Apollo for a while they were working on some of those issues. And so, but I was supporting the engineers. That's what the computers did. The engineers were all up and down the hall where we worked, and we had wind tunnels all around us and everything. And so I worked with them, and instead of, we talked about, somebody asked me what a computer does or why were they called computers, but generally they would bring in equations and said, would you solve this equation for so many independent variables? There was a mechanical calculator on the desk. They would take a huge spreadsheet, and the head computer would often take that equation and divide it into parts so that you could calculate a part of it for a different column of your big spreadsheet, and then toward the end you'd have the answer to the equation for that variable and everything. And so I never did that. I did have a calculator on my desk, but I knew how to program because I had studied Fortran when I was getting my master's degree at Virginia State. And so I would write a computer program if they wanted me to solve an equation and send that to them. So after doing that for a couple of years, I said, well, the equations that they are sending in here are very much like the equations I worked when I was in graduate school. And I really enjoyed those. And in applied math, you kind of knew what those equations were and all of that. And I said, I really would rather be doing what they're doing. And I said, but they're engineers and I'm a mathematician. When I was in Monroe, the engineers that I knew drove trains. So I didn't know much more about it after that. But so I said, well, somebody spoke to me. Somebody said to me, oh, well, there are 2 or 3 of those guys who have math degrees. They don't have engineering degrees. They have math degrees, but they're working in the engineering. And I says, well, gosh, that's what I want to be doing. So I asked the supervisor, could I be transferred to engineering? And he says, no, I don't think that's possible. So I was very disappointed in that. But I'd say a few weeks later, maybe a month or so later, I said, you know, I'm going to ask somebody else. I went to a director who was about 3 levels up. And I said, you know, I'd just like to talk to you a little bit. And I'd like to know why male and a female coming here with the same background are assigned to such different jobs. You know, the males are assigned to engineering, and they work on their own projects. They kind of, you know, lead a research area. They give talks about it. They write the paper. They get their names on the paper. And writing papers, they have a list of how many you've written when you go in for a promotion. So that they really count. I said, on the other hand, the females coming in here are, they don't work on their own projects. They work on what the engineer brings in for them to do. They don't give talks. They don't write papers. They don't get their names on a paper, and they don't get promoted for the most part. He says, nobody's ever asked that question before. I said, well, I'm asking it now. And so we talked a little bit. He did comment on how many of the females did marry the engineers and go home, but it was primarily the white females who married engineers and went home. In fact, his wife had been a computer. But we talked a little bit, and I left the office. And within a couple of weeks, I got promoted. I had not been promoted since I'd been there, and I got transferred to engineering office. So that was 1972. And in 1970, well, in the 60s, the United States, the English and the French and the Russians were all planning to build a supersonic transport. Supersonic meaning an airplane that flies faster than the speed of sound. Speed of sound at sea level, close to here, is 750 miles an hour. So that is the speed at which my voice is reaching your ear. And so we used to think that we couldn't go faster than the speed of sound, that the sound barrier stopped. You just couldn't get through it. But Chuck Yeager went faster than the speed of sound in 1947. And so now with the United States talking about building a supersonic transport, they found out when Chuck Yeager went through there and some of the other flights that there was a noise that accompanied that airplane when they were going faster than the speed of sound. They called it the sonic boom. And so the United States did some flight tests. They borrowed military airplanes from the Air Force or from the Army or whoever, and they flew them over Chicago and over Oklahoma City supersonically. And they had hundreds of people on phone banks answering the people who were calling about their cracked sheetrock, their cracked china, their cracked bay window, and everything else in their house that cracked. And I think they got paid for some of those things. So there were lots and lots of complaints. And the United States canceled their SST program in 1971. And they passed a law that said there could be no commercial supersonic flight over the continental United States. And that law is still on the books today. Most of the other countries around the world did the same thing. The English and the French went on to build the Concorde, which flew from 1976 until about 15 years ago, from Paris and London into New York and Washington. The Russians built the Tu-144. It had an accident at an air show in Paris, and it went back to Russia. They used it as a cargo plane in Russia, but not as a commercial airplane in Russia. And so, so what's a sonic boom? When I'm talking to students, I'll explain a little bit. There's an air pressure on your ear in this room. And if I were to blow up a balloon, I'm putting more molecules of air into the balloon, and the balloon is going up. And the pressure in the balloon is higher than the pressure outside the balloon. So now if I stick a pin in that balloon, there is a shock wave set up. It goes out at the speed of sound in all directions. And when that shock wave hits your ear, the pressure on your ear jumps instantaneously from what the pressure had been in the room to what the pressure was in the balloon. And it is that difference in jump in pressure, immediate jump in pressure, that you hear when you hear the pop of the balloon. So, I'm supposed to be doing this, right? This was the headline. I don't know if I told you this, that when I was in high school, I was a senior in high school the year that Sputnik went up. Sputnik, of course, is I mentioned it a little bit when I first started, didn't I? So that was kind of the headline that we saw that morning on October the 5th after the Sputnik had gone up, and traveling at 18,000 miles per hour in space around us. And in the movie, of course, the policeman looked up and said, "Are y'all getting ready to drop a bomb on us?" So everybody was afraid of that. I mean, that was a big, big worry. This is just Langley Research Center. That's the hangar there. And this is the building I sat in when I was hired. And these spheres are actually part of the wind tunnel system for hypersonic flight. Supersonic flight goes up to, I didn't say what Mach number was, but Mach is the name of the man who discovered how relative or how important the speed of sound was in the research that we were doing. And so Mach 1, I said, was 750 miles an hour. Mach 2 would be twice that. Mach 3 would be three times that. Well, when it gets up to Mach 5, they no longer call it supersonic. They call it hypersonic, because you start getting actually chemical changes in the atmosphere or ionization of the air. And so it's a whole different ball game at the hypersonic speeds. And with the blowdown tunnels using those, they'll pump one of these down to a vacuum. They'll put the other one at very high pressure air, and they will have a diaphragm in between the two of them. When they remove that diaphragm, the air from the high pressure one rushes into the vacuum, and it is at hypersonic speeds. The test is called a blowdown tunnel. It would only last as long as that air is rushing in. So it could be 30 seconds, it could be 40 seconds. But they actually read the data during those 40 seconds to actually prepare for the spaces where they have to be interested in those kinds of speeds for the spaceship and everything. So, so anyway, let's see, what was I saying? where was I? We were getting, the United States had passed a law and everything. Oh, okay, so once they passed the law that there could be no supersonic flight because of the sonic boom, NASA sort of says, well, you know, people really, really like to go fast, especially since the seats are so close in airplanes now. But what we will try to work on is there a way that we can reduce that sonic boom so maybe we can fly supersonically over land? And so my first assignment, well, that was the supersonic plane, which relates to the balloon. This airplane is going supersonically. All of the disturbances that it creates, it's moving molecules out of the way, you're getting shocks off different parts of the airplane and everything. All of the disturbances travel at the speed of sound. But the airplane is going faster than the speed of sound. Has anybody in here ever heard of sonic boom? Yeah, and so when you hear the sonic boom, you really don't see anything when you look straight up, because the airplane is way down there somewhere, and so you actually end up looking down there. So the airplane is traveling faster than all of the disturbances. Everything that this airplane generates, where it generates the disturbance, is inside this cone attached to the nose. And the pressure inside that cone is higher than the pressure outside that cone. So this might be at 30 or 40,000 feet in the atmosphere. Where it intersects the ground is this dark green area. And so if you were standing right here, you would be outside that cone. But if that airplane moved a little bit further, it would draw that over you, and you would suddenly have that instantaneous change in pressure again. You would go from the normal pressure, you would go from the normal pressure outside the cone to what was the pressure inside the cone, and you would hear the sonic boom. That's when you're outside. Of course, in your house, you start getting vibrations and everything of your house also. So it's a kind of a different ball game when it is inside something. But, so my first job when I moved to the engineering section, I was given a technical paper by a couple of professors from Cornell University where they had the idea that how you design the airplane could impact how loud the sonic boom would be. And so this measure here would be the equivalent area. Most of your military airplanes that fly supersonically have an equivalent area that looks like this top curve. She told me not to touch that. When I finished the program, this paper was full of equations and everything, which I had to solve and get the program running. And it said if I gave the input of the Mach number, the speed of the airplane, the weight of the airplane, the length of the airplane, and the altitude of the airplane, the output of the code would be the equivalent area of an airplane that would have a minimized sonic boom. So that's what the code did that I wrote. And so what's the equivalent area? If you were slicing a lemon, and everywhere you sliced it, you calculated that area there. That's the one number at that point. If you sliced it in the middle, you'd get another number at that point. If you sliced it over by the end, you'd have a much smaller number. So the curve, if you plotted those numbers, would be almost like a bell curve for a lemon, because it would start out closer, much smaller number. It would get bigger toward the middle and then go back down at the other end. You do the airplane the same way. You have the axis of the airplane and you step along that axis and you calculate the area everywhere you step. And you get the point for each place, and you would plot that point along the axis location, and that would be your area due to volume. There's one other thing. The four characteristics of an airplane that are kind of basic are the four forces. You have the gravity pulling you down. You got the drag pushing you back. And for youth, we always say if you put your hand out the window of a car and it's moving, your hand is going to go back that way because the air pushes your hand back that way. Pushes an airplane the same way. It pushes it back, and that's called the drag of an airplane. You got the thrust, which is the engine at the back. Well, have you ever blown up a balloon and held the lip of the balloon and then turn it loose? What happens to that balloon? It flies. It flies. The air comes out this way, and the balloon goes that way, right? Well, airplane is the same way. The engine is back there. The exhaust of the engine is coming out the back, but it's pushing the airplane forward. So we've got the drag, the gravity, the thrust. There's one other force. Something's got to hold it up. What holds the airplane up? Well, that's why the wings are on the airplane. So the top of the wing is curved, and the air flows over it, and the curved surface makes the air go faster. So the air across the top of the wing is faster than the air under the wing, because the under the wing is pretty near flat. It's kind of flat. And so now we have more pressure under the wing and a lower pressure on top of the wing. So the resultant force on that wing is what? Lift. That is, you've got the force here that's pushing it up. That's what's holding the airplane up. So generally the lift of the airplane has to match the weight of the airplane because it's got to hold that up in the air. So those are the four forces. So we need to do the same thing for the lift distribution. Along the axis of that airplane, we go along, and at every point on the lift curve, we get the area of the lift at that point. And so we get a distribution of the air equivalent area due to lift. We add the equivalent area due to volume and the equivalent area due to lift together. We add them together, and what we're trying to do is get to that curve that came out of that program. Now, the first time we started designing airplanes, first time I designed an airplane, it looked more like this. And so then you have to go back and say, well, I need to change my design and try to drive my design down to that other curve. And so you go back and you change your design. And we had other codes that would help calculate the lift of the airplane and things like that so we could do it. But we spent months and weeks and years, I'm not sure it was years, but we spent a long time driving that design. And if you look at this, you can actually see that that's two curves. There's a solid curve there and there's a dash curve there, where it had actually gotten to that. Once you got a close match, then you send your design to the shop and have a model built of that design. And this was a Mach 2 design. Flat wings. It's not very fancy. It was pretty stable. We were getting ready to test that, and we always tried to test the best baseline when we did that. For instance, we would one of the flying supersonic military airplanes, just a plain delta wing or something like that. We would also build a model of that and test it at the same time to see what the difference what the difference was in the results of our design and the design that we really kind of knew what it was. So this is the wind tunnel. This is a supersonic wind tunnel at Langley. Wind tunnel is suppose there was a big tube, of boxes or something that went all the way around this room. It was open. It had walls on all the sides, but it was open on the inside. And so lots of science fairs, if you've ever been to science fairs, some kids do wind tunnels. They'll use a box, a cardboard box, and they'll put a big fan at one end, and they'll try to measure the lift on the airplane that's sitting inside that box. That's what they would do with a scale or something. But so when people are doing airplane research, it is a lot cheaper to build a 7-inch model. That model costs $7,000, but it doesn't cost $300 million like those in flying through the air cost. So it's a lot cheaper to do your research in a wind tunnel like this. And so this model is in the middle of the tunnel. This mechanism back here, and there's a gap here, allows that airplane to move back and forth a little bit inside the tunnel. But the air is going past that airplane at Mach 2. So instead of the airplane flying at Mach 2 speed, the air is being blown past the airplane at Mach 2 speed. Okay, so when this airplane has gotten sort of forward, you remember that cone that was on the airplane? Okay, so then this is going to get a cone on it. And that cone is going to reach over here and cover that pressure probe right there. And that pressure probe is going to tell you what the pressure is inside that cone. There's another pressure probe up here, up at the top that you can't really see, that measures the pressure outside of that cone. And it is the difference in those two pressures that determines the loudness of that shock coming off that airplane and everything. And so we did lots of tests like this. First test like this, I think the first time we ran a test, we had a delta wing, which was a very common model, and it gave a big N wave. So the difference from the low point on that pressure to the high point on that pressure was bigger, and that's how loud that noise is that you're hearing. And but when we did the one that we were designing and everything, it wasn't as high, and instead of going up looking like an N, because they called it an N wave, it would kind of go flat across. It wasn't quite straight, but it would be a lot lower and would stay kind of flat. And so, this looks like it's going to work. So we spent quite a few years, and there were some gaps in here because when they canceled the SST program, they canceled our funds too. But after I think we had a gap of a few years before they came back and said, well, we'll give you this money to work the environmental problems that you need to work, which would be sonic boom and noise and things like that. And so we did that a lot of years. By that time, we had started bringing in people from Boeing and McDonnell Douglas and Lockheed Martin, and they were doing some designs and testing and everything too. And we said, this works. we are actually getting a lower boom by designing these airplanes following that model and everything. So what we really now need to do is not just stop with the wind tunnel. We need to do a flight test to make sure it's okay, make sure it really works. So we borrowed 2 F-5 supersonic airplanes from the Air Force. And here you see the red figure would be the one that we were just talking about that generated the bigger shock, the red line here. And then the black one would be more like the one we designed, where you have a smaller difference and it looks rather flat over there. So this was called the sonic boom demonstrator. It is the F-5 on which panels have been added to make the equivalent area match the equivalent area we did our design to. And so this is out in California at the NASA Center out next to Edwards Air Force Base. And so they were flown out there at the design speed. And the bottom one is the F-5 that has no modifications to it. This is the one you just looked at. And the top one there is an F-15 that's got a pressure probe on the nose, and it actually measures the shocks coming off of these airplanes at altitude. And so when you're doing the test, you generally try to get a measurement all the way to the ground. So you get it at altitude, and then you have slower planes measuring it further down, and then you have ground measurements. So you can actually look at the signal coming all the way to the ground. I was not in California the day that they did this test. A friend of mine was. He called me, and you could hear the shouts in the control room. And just like the shouts when John Glenn came safely back to Earth after orbiting the Earth, and everybody was really glad he was safe. These folks were really glad. They got a big N wave from this camouflage one. They got that much smaller one from the one, our design. And we said, this really works. It works. This test was in 2002. And so we said, well, now the next thing is, that middle airplane we're so happy with, it looks like a porpoise. So you wouldn't want a supersonic airplane flying around kind of looking like that. So the next step needed to be a real airplane designer would integrate what an efficient, low-drag supersonic airplane looks like. Integrate that efficient supersonic airplane with the low sonic boom airplane. And so you got to integrate them into the same plane. And so this is one that Lockheed Martin designed. And this was just within the last couple of years. And so it's been like 15 years since we had done the flight test. So Lockheed Martin had designed this, and they were doing some testing in our wind tunnels and everything on this. But at the same time, NASA got $247 million in their budget in 2017 to build a supersonic low boom X plane. X meaning experimental plane. So Lockheed Martin won the bid for the contract in March of this year. They say it's going to take 3 years for them to build that airplane. I think it will be called the X-59. And once they build that airplane, of course, they've got to take it through there. Is it a good airplane? Does it fly well? Is it a good supersonic plane? So they would have to take it through all of the things that they would carry a supersonic airplane through. And then they will fly it over you all and get you to answer questions about would this noise bother you if there were airplanes flying over you all day long generating it. And that would be done to lots of different people all over the country. And then the data from the results of what you say will be taken to the FAA, and we would ask them to consider changing the rules such that supersonic commercial flight is allowed in the United States. So I'm actually really, really thrilled that they have built this that they're building this airplane, and they're going to do that. And as I told somebody else recently, when I was teaching, we used to say how joyful you were when a student in your classroom actually learned something and you saw that spark in their eye that they knew what you were talking about. Well, I guess the fact that they are building this airplane and we'll see if it really works, I'm kind of joyful about that too. And although I had to wait 30 years for 30 years to get that glow. So that's kind of what my career was. Once we did that flight test back in 2002 and a little bit before, I actually went into the management. So I spent the rest of my career at NASA at managing different offices and things like that. And in the introduction, she told you that I actually had the education office under me and the public affairs office under me at last. But I was in also strategic planning at one time. And then my first supervisory job was the aeronautics jobs that were managed at the other centers that we did at Langley, like air traffic management, the engines that we were working on there, computational fluid dynamics, because we started using that too. There's always been sort of a push between, can you do everything in the wind tunnel, or can you do it all on a computer now? Since computers have gotten so big and everything, there's some people say you don't need wind tunnels anymore because the computer can do it all, and that's a great debate. But I was really fascinated when I saw one of the mathematics articles recently where mathematics is now going into bioengineering much more. And so there were some university folks who had done calculations on the heart and the heart beating. And the title of the article was, they are predicting that doctors have not been treating heart disease properly. So I said, well, I think that would allow them to learn from each other. If there is a problem there, the mathematics could help what is in real life, and so and I think the same thing for wind tunnels and computational methods here too. So so that's kind of my career, and I've been retired 10 years. And if anybody has any questions or any comments, I would be glad. Somebody's in charge, not me. So does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask, or?
Is that plane just for one person, the pilot?
No, it's not. I think that's 100 and some people. It's very thin. The Concorde was, in fact, very thin. Supersonic airplanes, and like I said, you want the drag to be low. They're often very slender airplanes. The engine of an airplane generally casts a big shock. And so you notice that they've got this one on top of the airplane, so that shock would go up rather than down toward the ground. The basic theory behind these designs are you try not to get a lot of coalescence of the shocks because they reinforce each other and the shocks get bigger. So you try to have them come down such that they are all coming separately down, and you take advantage of them getting softer on the travel through the air. So that's kind of the basic theory. And because there's a long nose on here, they've actually also got to have a system here where the pilot sits that enables them to know what's going on out here, since they can't see over that nose very well. And so they're working on the things to go with this to make it a real good airplane. Yes, ma'am.
Do you like to fly?
Do I like to fly? Would I like to fly? I think I would certainly fly it. I applied to be an astronaut twice, and I would have gone. I didn't make it, but I did apply, and I think I would. Yes, and I think I would fly in that, and I think I'd be happy to fly in it. Yes.
So you've been traveling, inspiring young people to become engineers and mathematicians. You visited institutions. What are characteristics of institutions that are encouraging young people? Have you seen places you've walked into and said, this is what I would like to see more of, getting young people excited about the things that I enjoy?
The characteristics of institutions, well, I would think that they certainly need to treat everybody the same, I would think. Now, I've been to a number of female engineering schools where they are having trouble holding on to the females in the engineering area. And so while engineering is really what I like, and I think, you know, you come out of school making more money in many of these STEM areas, but ultimately people need to work at their passion. They need to work at something that they really, really enjoy. Now, I think that there is a big possibility that, I would argue against them if what they enjoyed paid them $10 an hour, you know, kind of thing, because some of our young people say, well, this is what I enjoy, and then they can't pay for anything. So, you know, to be able to go to work and just be happy going to work every day is what you really want. And I was like that. Once I left the computer office, I was happy. You know, I did different things every day. I wrote papers, I gave talks, I went to conferences, I went to meetings. You know, I just did a lot of different things. I led the national team that kind of decided how we would approach this. So it needs to be something that they would enjoy, but then just the example I just told you about the heart and the computational things. So more and more you see folks who come in and they might take an area they're really passionate about and actually combine it with an area. It could be mathematics, in which they are using both. So they still have something that they really enjoy, but now they have it. They have, you know, an element in there that is STEM and that is paying more per hour than a lot of jobs that our young people are taking. So I think it's both, but there is still a lot of concern about our young women. I often, two things there. I think a lot of our elementary school teachers don't particularly like math and science, and I think that hurts, especially our girls. You know, it might be some men too, but I think a lot of girls and other people hurt our girls. They say, oh, girls don't do that. Girls don't do such and such a thing. And I tell the parents, don't let people talk to your girls like that. Let the girl find out what it is they really enjoy. I don't think my parents ever told me I couldn't do anything except my daddy telling me to teach. But I don't think they ever told me I couldn't do this and things like that. So I think that harms our girls. But the girls are now telling me that very often it is the young men in their classes that are giving them a hard time, and I think why many of them are dropping out of certain areas. And I did not go through that element, I think. I didn't give you the talk about my going to school, but once I got the job in engineering, I figured I needed an engineering degree. And so NASA had an excellent graduate program where an engineer was given a year's worth of hours of graduate school. So you could go to a class during the workday, and you know that's 2 hours a day or something like that. Or you could take off the semester and not have to work at all. Or you could take off the whole year, and go away to Stanford or something like that. So they had a really great program. So George Washington University ran the program at Langley, and I said, well, since I've already got a master's, I'm going to try to go for a doctorate in mechanical engineering. And that's what I did. But then my pause came in. All of my background in school was in segregated schools. I did not work with any whites until I went to NASA Langley. And so I had grown up with this idea that all white people were really, really smart. And that was frightening. And so, but I said, I'm going to do it. And so I signed up and I went to my first class, and sure enough, there were 8 or 10 white engineers in there. And nobody said anything to me. So we went through 3 or 4 weeks of class, and we had a test. This test had a lot of math in it. And after we got our papers back, 2 of the engineers walked over to me and said, hey, we wondered if you'd like to join our study group. And I said, yeah, that would be great. You know, and so after that, I kind of got along with most of them. Everybody didn't speak to me. But we went through almost all of our classes, you know, knowing the people that we were in class with. So it worked out well for me, and I ended up being one of the few that went all the way through the program and graduated. So, but I was afraid. That was a tough decision for me to make because I was sort of afraid in there. Yes?
What was your choice? You said you got your doctorate in mechanical engineering. Why not aeronautical engineering?
Well, that was because George Washington didn't offer aeronautical engineering, and so the closest to it was mechanical engineering with the emphasis in fluid mechanics. Yeah. Yes?
This is a great example of opportunity to get your word out to parents. You talked about teachers and how teachers can influence their students, but a lot of influence is needed at the parent level. Parents come home from work at night, they're tired, maybe don't have the patience or the background to push their students along. But do you have any opinion about how we can do more to engender parent support for their students to make sure that they're working as hard as
Well, you know, you've got some parents who are in there all the time, and so that is a tough question. There are some parents that hardly pay any attention to what their kids are doing, you know, and I don't know what you could do, but my church did article about the public school system a few years ago, and I had the privilege to study some of the charter schools. There are some boarding schools that are charter schools. Washington, D.C. had one where they chose those students by lottery off the streets in D.C. But it's a charter school, but they also had a foundation helping to support it because those students it started in the 7th grade and went through high school. They went on Sunday evening and they stayed till Friday evening. So it was a boarding school that long, and I think the rate was $26,000 a student instead of $10,000, which is kind of what Virginia had. And they had the teachers that taught them their classes during the day. They had another set of teachers come in and work with them in study hall that night. And they had people who drove them to the extracurricular activities. When that first graduating class came out of there, those students were going to Duke, Princeton, and some of the finest schools in the country because they had gotten what they needed. Their environment was controlled. So my other theory is I would like to see some of the for-profit prisons done away with, and we take the money there and put it into maybe some boarding schools where our students could get the support and environments that they need, and then maybe we wouldn't need the prisons. So that's my sermon for today.
Here's a question over there.
Yes.
Theoretically, if a sonic boom was to go off in a populated area, how much of an impact will that create?
Well, it depends on how loud it is. You know, sometimes it sounds like thunder. We hear thunder at lots of levels. We hear thunder that doesn't sound very loud. Sometimes we hear thunder that's really, really loud. So that is when I said they were going to do the test, and they were going to fly that airplane over people, and they would be responding to how disturbed they were by that boom, or whether they could almost ignore that sonic boom. So that's why we would fly it over a lot of people, and fly it over you, and have you give your opinion about how much it disturbed you. Got it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Follow-up question on her thing about the sonic boom. In your experience in working with this particular thing, Marquis Lawton is going to do the contract of, you say, in 2021, it will be 2021.
Yeah, they're saying it would take them 3 years to build it.
Based on your experience, if it comes to be that is a plan, how soon do you see a plane that will fly from the West Coast to the East Coast, or the East Coast to the West Coast? I think I heard you say it will be cut down from 5 hours to 3 hours. How long do you think
Before that happens? Well, now, okay, so the laws would have to be changed. But if the laws are changed, then the Concorde was technically really a great airplane. But the Concorde failed because of economics, because they only built 14 of them because nobody was buying them. I learned in the museum in Texas yesterday that Braniff Airlines had the Concorde in this country, I guess. But you built 14 airplanes. The English and the French were both putting money into building that airplane, and they were both putting money into flying that airplane. Plus, almost only rich people flew it. Because I called in the 70s about the price, and it was I think like $1,200 or $1,500 or something to fly overseas on that airplane. The only routes they could fly were what? Across the water for the most part. So they didn't have anywhere to fly it, so nobody was buying that airplane or building that airplane. So if this works, then the Boeings and the Lockheed Martins they've got to say, well, we're going to start building these airplanes, and then the Americans and the Deltas and so forth have got to buy that airplane and start flying it on those routes. Our government would also have to negotiate with the other governments around the country to get them to change their laws. And so there would be some time, for that to get done, but you would have to go through that process so that when you call Delta to get a ticket, you could get on a supersonic airplane to fly across country.
So 20 years.
Maybe not 20. I don't know. Yes.
The issue with the Concorde was because of the thinness that you mentioned, that the number of seats per plane was relatively limited, so that caused part of the economic issue.
Well, it might have been that, but they didn't build enough airplanes either. Because I think with most other airplanes, it is the number of them that they build and sell that helps recover the money. And so building 14, they didn't recover anything. And so it probably a combination. Yeah, people told me how narrow it was, and I'm not even sure about the height and everything. Yes?
What's the impact of the pressure difference in the cabin?
You're in nothing, because you're inside that cone.
So it has to be really well insulated.
Yeah, you're not encountering, while it's going supersonic, it is outside the cone where the pressure is different, but inside there, they say it's fine. Yeah, the people that I have heard who have flown it.
And they still fly at 30,000 feet?
Hmm?
They still fly at 30,000 feet?
Well, it might be higher than 30,000 feet, but yeah, it would be the same. But you're not encountering what the people outside that are hearing that pressure change are encountering.
So the pressure is higher inside the
It's inside the cone, but it's all around the airplane is the same. Yeah. Yes.
Is there an optimum speed? You talk about Mach 1, Mach 2, Mach 3. Is there a sort of a diminishing return? Like, for example, what speed is this trying to fly at?
Okay, they would design, the one that they're planning on building, they're actually talking about 1.4. So yes, we have done charts where we look at the impact of Mach number, the impact of length, the impact of weight. Certainly one of the things that we looked at when we were looking at it, would advances in any other areas help this? Well, if you could build the whole thing out of composite materials, then the airplane would be a lot lighter, and that would certainly make a big difference too. So, you always try to be aware of where something outside your area could come in and have a huge impact on what you're trying to do. Yes, ma'am.
Who is putting the engine on the plane?
Well, the engine would be built by an engine company.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Who do you know?
No, I don't know. I don't know, and I know that there are a couple of supersonics. There's a company in Denver called Boom, which is planning to. They're building an airplane, but they're not trying to minimize the boom. They're just planning to go over water, go to Japan.
Yeah.
and back. And I think Japan has actually ordered several of their airplanes. And so it's, I mean, there's a lot of talk about supersonics right now. And the engine is a critical piece of it. I might have read that in one of the articles, but for a lot of this design, they tried to use, just to hold the price of the airplane down, they tried to use a lot of parts of existing airplanes such that they would not have the cost of developing a new part, maybe the landing gear and things like that. That's what they have tried to do there. Yes?
I assume we have lots of code in Fortran. Is Fortran still used at Langley? Are you aware?
I don't know. I don't really know what they're using out there now, but I would guess not. I have bought some other books saying I was going to teach myself some other languages or take some other programming courses, but life just gets busy and everybody wants you doing everything else when you quit work.
Yeah.
Yes.
I want to step back just a little bit. You know, just like teachers will inspire a young learner to excel in an area or encourage them to move forward, what if a young learner was discouraged early on? What words can you, or what can you share with us to someone that, say a minority child that was, a teacher said, embarrassed them when they raised their hand, so they don't pursue it because they feel like, oh, I'm going to be laughed at or whatever. What words could you give a young learner to help them do it for themselves? You know, what could we give them? What tools when they've been discouraged to do it?
Well, I guess if you help them to be successful, I think that's one way that people start getting a different feeling about a subject or an area because they are doing better in that area, I think. But I'm not the expert in all of that. But I would think, that somebody has worked with that child and that child sees themselves, really excelling in an area, and they would start to feel positive there. I really enjoyed physics. One of my earlier physics teacher I really liked, he died at the end of the year, and the school brought in another physics teacher the next year. And every one of us in that class almost hated the subject of physics by the time we got out. So it can be devastating, and but then I say if I went to another great teacher, I don't think there would be a problem with that. I would still have that love, and I think maybe I worked in it, and I still enjoyed it. So yes, ma'am.
Do you miss it? Was it hard to retire?
I think I do miss it. I went back and went to a couple of meetings that they had afterwards. They wrote some books to kind of summarize. I worked on editing some of the books and everything. But I guess there were several reasons for retiring. I said, well, I really should go and try to spend more time with my grandchildren and great-grandchildren. And my daughter called me just short of 40 years. Her husband, she was in Colorado. Her husband was being transferred to Georgia. And she was going to be still in Colorado a while. And she calls and said, are you going to retire and come down here and help me with the children? So that's what I did. And so I went out to Colorado and helped her with the kids and helped them sell the house and help them get back across country and everything. So that part, there's always that draw, I guess, of a working woman's heart where you've got issues like that too. And so I try to spend as much time with the kids. And when they moved to Georgia, I would try to bring her two boys to Virginia during the summer all the time, and so we did all the historical stuff. We went to Mount Monticello, we went to Mount Vernon, we went to Yorktown, Williamsburg, Jamestown, Kitty Hawk, and so the next year the oldest one called and says, well, grandmother, what historical things are we going to do this summer? So there are those difficulties that you run into too, and I was eligible to retire. Yes.
As far as extracurricular, you mentioned Toastmasters and certain career and other careers, what of those organizations would you encourage people to see their children get involved in? Were there particular ones you saw really active in that help?
Well, the Toastmasters was the talking. My mother gave me a conversation course. She says, Christine, you don't talk enough. And she gave me a course about how you walk into a room and you start talking to people and things you could kind of start a conversation on, because she talked a lot more than I did. I might be just a little bit more of the introvert, something. So, yes. Came and went? Well, none have really come yet. We had designs, we had models and everything, but we didn't have any. This is going to be the first airplane built for the commercial program. The military has some supersonic planes. But as far as trying to reduce that boom, this would be the first. That's why it's an experimental plane. It is to see if this works. And so not a lot of them came and went. And I didn't finish that other question. You know, I think carrying young people to museums, and a lot of them have educational kind of programs, the library's doing some. I think those kinds of activities to just expose young people to a variety of things are very important, and that they even know that they exist. You know, sometimes you don't even know that there's a job that exists in something that you might actually find out that you really like. So I think that's important, and so if we let our children be exposed, I took my grandkids to Jamestown, in Hampton, and it was a slow afternoon. I had 3 of them with me, and we went into the fort. They actually were tanning hides. They saw how they tanned hides. They stood there with the docent making tools out of bones. They saw how they ground the grain and stuff in the thing on there. And they asked questions. They asked all of them. They held every sphere, every gun. They put on their helmets. Those people spent all afternoon answering their questions, and I thought that was a valuable experience for them. And when we went to Mount Vernon, we saw the movie, and the guy in the movie said that when the painter painted Washington crossing the Delaware, he didn't know what the official flag was, because he had a flag with a circle of stars or something, and he said that was not the official flag. And he said that in the movie, and we were mad. When I flew those kids back to Atlanta, my grandson looked up and said, "Hey, Grandma, there's that picture with that wrong flag in it." Yes, he did. Yes.
How about your daughters? Did they go into math and science or something else?
My youngest daughter went to Spelman and Georgia Tech, and she got the degree in math and mechanical engineering from Spelman, Georgia Tech. So she did go into that area. But it was interesting that she said to me that she didn't have the personality to sit at a computer all day like I did, because she actually is a little bit more of a people person than I am, I believe. And but she I guess used that degree, and she's a vice president at Dish Network now. In sales and everything, but being able to explain the products and everything, I think she has used her degree in that. The other daughter teaches elementary school, 2nd or 3rd grade, and yeah, she did. She did.
Excuse me.
Yes.
You mentioned your daughter. Do you know Dr. Geraldine Darden?
Mm-hmm. That's my sister-in-law.
Okay.
Yeah, my husband. She actually taught me in school.
Geraldine?
Yes.
Okay, good. Okay. I wondered about that.
Okay, yes.
Did you run into a math problem that you could not solve?
Yeah, I've run into a lot of them. And I've even had the experience of dreaming of a solution in the middle of the night and jumping up and say, I got to write this down because I know I won't remember it in the morning. But in doing my thesis, my advisor was Oriental, Chinese. And he went to China one year, and I ran into something I kind of didn't know what to do with, and I didn't know how to get in touch with him, so I had to wait for him to come back. But I also have been, I go through a lot of libraries. Langley had a great library, so I would go through a lot of textbooks and things of a particular subject, because the authors have different examples in the textbooks. They have different ways of explaining things in the textbook. So I have found that very helpful. You know, if I'm running into something I don't quite understand, because where one person might not explain it very well, very often somebody else will explain it. And so I also do a lot of that. And I would study in the library a lot too.
I was going to say, I don't think there's any one, when people ask what they do about encouraging kids, I don't think there's any one solution to doing it. I think the thing that you just mentioned, I do with my grandkids, is the exposure. I think people in here that have nieces and nephews and things like that, get involved with what they do, get involved in terms of sharing that knowledge and everything. It's amazing how much young folks can absorb when you share experiences. You know,
That's very true.
It takes the whole community, but I think everybody, if you got the time, get involved.
Yeah, I think the exposing to even know that those careers are out there. You know, everybody says, we didn't know women were doing so and so and so and so. And another thing that happened, we used to do a lot of talking at schools, and when the SOLs came along, all of a sudden they were teaching to the test. And so they didn't have time for anybody from the outside to come in and say, these are the kind of jobs we have at our school. This is the kind of preparation you generally need to do a job like that. So I think that's very sad. And another thing sad, Virginia had an article in the paper this year that they could not find enough math teachers. Math people can usually get another job. But their solution was to reduce the requirements for the math teachers.
Oh.
Now I said, now that's the pits, and I guess I should have written a letter. But and that's awful. That is awful, because you're going to have somebody less prepared up there trying to teach your kids. And I came out of college about the time of the new math coming along, and I was at Virginia State where they were running some workshops for some of the teachers who were teaching some of this new math in their classrooms. And I know that their students were confused because those teachers were so confused they didn't know what to do. So, you know, they're having somebody in many of these things trained in this subject is really, I think, kind of important, who is able to work with the kids and explain it well and everything, because you don't want to confuse them even worse than they are. So, thank you for your comments.
So many, when you and I came along in terms of school, finished the school, I think a lot of people went in that had the math background and the science background went in to teach it. Because I knew an example of my brother-in-law, when he came out of school in the 70s, he went to work for Dow Chemical and Mission as a synthetic chemist. And those people that used to be in the schools that taught math and science and had the love for it, now had opportunities elsewhere, and you don't. You know, a lot of people are going into those areas and work for companies where you had this concentration of people that could teach that, you know, they look elsewhere for employment. Because I think I heard you say that the salaries are not good and everything until we put it.
Well, yeah, and that's why they can't find math teachers now, because the people are they're getting other jobs. Because when I got the offer from NASA, and I think I said it here, I had applied to a couple of universities who offered me $4,000 apiece. NASA offered me $9,000. My husband said, take the $9,000. so you know, that's nobody can believe what we made starting out, but that's what we made.
Play an important part too. I have a son who's a project manager for an architect firm, a graduate of North Carolina A&T, and their company they go into the middle schools and they tutor in math. They spend a couple hours a week being involved in the public schools, and again, that's an involvement from the industry standpoint, being involved. He talks about kids going to the schools and working with kids.
And I think that's very important, and a lot of groups in the military and a lot of young people do go into schools and do that. I don't know if anybody's measuring the impact of things like that or not, but I think nobody's going into teaching now. When when I was coming along, the list of teachers was huge. But now, if you get a list that big from most schools, that's what you get for the people who are teaching. And I think that's sad. I think our country doesn't appreciate teachers well enough. I think they need more appreciation. And was it here where I mentioned the cover of Time magazine? Yeah, which talks about, I have this degree, I so and so and so and so, I have to give blood to pay my bills. I am a public school teacher.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I didn't see that. Oh, wow.
So, and I think that is pretty sad testimony for us, because teachers impact our children tremendously. Well, I thank you all so very much for coming and for participating. Thank you. Thank you.